If someone had told me a simple dinner invitation would lead me to a moment that shifted the way I looked at myself, I would have laughed it off. Yet, here I am, sitting quietly with the memory of that night lingering like a psalm that refuses to leave your mind. It wasn't wild or reckless, but something deeper, an unexpected connection that felt like a mirror reflecting back pieces of me I had long tucked away. I didn't know my friend's boss, Walter, could change my world, but he did, in the most surprising way. Before I begin, I'd love to know, from which cities are you watching us tonight? Are you tuning in from a busy place where traffic hums in the background, or a quiet small town where you can hear the crickets sing? Wherever you are, imagine yourself here with me, because this story is about more than just one evening. It's about rediscovery. It all started on a Thursday evening when my friend Clara insisted I come along to a small gathering at her house. She said it would be casual, just a few people from her office, nothing fancy. I was hesitant at first. My week had been heavy, and honestly, I hadn't been in the mood for company in quite a while. But she pressed on with that familiar warmth of hers, reminding me how long it had been since I'd done something for myself. I gave in, though I promised myself I would only stay for a short while. When I arrived, Clara's home glowed with a soft light that spilled out onto the porch. Inside, the air smelled of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread. The sound of laughter drifted through the hallway as I stepped in, greeted by faces I didn't know. People were chatting in groups, glasses clinking gently, voices rising and falling in a rhythm that felt both familiar and distant. And then there he was, Walter. Clara introduced him as her boss, the head of her department. At first glance, he wasn't the sort of man who demanded attention, yet somehow he held it all the same. His hair was touched with silver, his frame steady, his voice calm but certain. When his eyes met mine, I felt something stir, a quiet recognition, though we had never met before. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, polite smiles, small talk about how we knew Clara. But as the evening stretched on, our conversations deepened in unexpected ways. We found ourselves side by side near the kitchen, away from the main chatter, talking about books, travels, and the odd ways life leads us down paths we never saw coming. He listened with an attentiveness that felt rare, like each word mattered, not just filling silence. The more we talked, the more I noticed the small things, the way he tilted his head slightly when I spoke, the quiet laughter that rumbled low in his chest, the subtle way he leaned in closer, not out of boldness, but out of genuine interest. It had been so long since I'd felt that kind of attention, the kind that doesn't seek to impress or conquer, but simply to understand. At one point, Clara passed by with a grin that told me she had noticed something I hadn't yet allowed myself to fully see. She gave me a little wink, as though she had orchestrated the moment herself. I brushed it off, though deep down, I knew she wasn't wrong. Later, as the night settled into a softer tone, people gathered in the living room. The lights dimmed a little, the music shifted to something slow, almost reflective. I found myself seated across from Walter, a small table with empty glasses between us. The group's conversation floated around us, but our eyes stayed fixed on each other, as though the rest of the room had faded into a gentle blur. He spoke about a recent trip he had taken to the countryside, describing the rolling hills, the quiet mornings, the stillness that reminded him of his younger days. There was a tenderness in the way he painted the scene, as though he carried pieces of it with him still. I found myself leaning into his words, not just listening, but feeling them. And when I shared my own stories, my childhood summers at my grandmother's house, the way the sun would set over the river behind her garden, he listened in return, eyes warm, steady, almost protective. It struck me then how rare it was to be seen like that, not as someone's employee or neighbor or friend's plus one, but as a person with her own layers and longings. Jacqueline. Me, just as I was, in that moment. As the night drew on, Clara began gathering plates, and people slowly trickled out. I helped clear the dishes, and Walter joined me in the kitchen. The silence between us was different now, charged but calm. When our hands brushed as we reached for the same glass, I felt a warmth ripple through me. Not the dizzying rush of infatuation, but something steadier, something that reminded me I was still capable of feeling alive in ways I had almost forgotten. We lingered there, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. He didn't rush the moment, and neither did I. Instead, he smiled, soft, knowing, almost hesitant. "You know," he said gently, "I didn't expect tonight to feel like this." I nodded, unable to find the right words, but understanding him completely. It wasn't about grand gestures or declarations. It was about presence, respect, and a connection that came so unexpectedly it startled me awake inside. And as I left that evening, the cool night air brushing against my face, I knew something within me had shifted. Walter wasn't just my friend's boss anymore. He had become a mirror, showing me pieces of myself I hadn't dared to look at in years. I drove home slowly, the city lights reflecting on my windshield, my thoughts tumbling over themselves. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, I was open to finding out. Would you like me to now continue and write Chapter 2, making it a long continuation where Jacqueline reflects deeper on this unexpected bond with Walter and how it develops further into something meaningful? The morning after Clara's dinner, I woke to birds chattering on the balcony rail and a square of sunlight warming the foot of my bed. My phone rested face down on the nightstand, as if it too had needed a long sleep. When I turned it over, there was a message from Clara. 3 words and a winking face. "So, Walter, huh?" I set the phone down without replying. It wasn't that I didn't want to talk about him. It was that I didn't know how to talk about what had happened without making it sound bigger or smaller than it was. There had been no grand declarations, no breathless promises. And yet my chest felt a little roomier, as if I'd opened a window I didn't know was painted shut. I made coffee and stood at the counter while the kettle hissed. In the reflection of the microwave door, I saw myself. Hair askew, robe wrapped tight, a woman who had learned how to keep her days tidy and predictable. It had served me well. It had also kept me safe. But safety, I realized, can sometimes be a room with no doors. Just as I lifted the mug to my lips, the phone buzzed again. A new message, unfamiliar number. "Good morning, Jacqueline. This is Walter. Thank you for the conversation last night. If you'd like, I know a little cafe near the river that roasts their beans on site. No pressure at all. If this is inconvenient, I understand." I read it 3 times, smiling before I realized I was smiling. There was no assumption in his words, no leaning in too far. Just an invitation placed gently on the table, like a napkin beside a plate. I replied that the afternoon would be fine. The cafe lived in the old brick corner building near the pedestrian bridge, the kind of place where the windows were fogged in winter and propped open in summer. The door chime sighed when I walked in, and the warmth wrapped around me, a mixture of roasted coffee, cinnamon, and a sweetness I couldn't place. Walter stood near the counter, reading the chalkboard menu as if it might change right then. He looked up when the chime sounded, and his face softened, not with surprise but recognition, as though we were both arriving to a conversation already half begun. We ordered and took a table by the window. Outside, the river slid along as steady as an old thought. Inside, the steam rose from our cups. He asked about my work, not the job title but the parts I loved and the parts I endured. I told him about the quiet satisfaction of finishing something that had no applause attached to it, and the loneliness that sometimes threaded through days that looked full from the outside. He listened the way he had at Clara's, head slightly tilted, eyes steady. When he spoke, he did it slowly, not to fill the air, but to share it. He told me he'd been in leadership long enough to know that the best parts of it were almost invisible to anyone looking from the outside. You help someone at the right moment, with no credit and no story, and they move forward without even remembering your name. He didn't say it like a martyr. He said it the way someone might talk about tending a garden before sunrise, because it's the best time for the plants. At one point, he paused and rubbed the edge of his cup with his thumb. "I want to be careful," he said, "about the shape of this. Clara is my employee. You are her friend. If this ever makes either of you uncomfortable, I need to know. I'd like to keep my respect for you and for her unclouded." It was disarming, that combination of steadiness and care. I told him I appreciated that, and that honesty would be our first rule. He nodded like a man who values rules not because he loves limits, but because he knows they make good things last. We left the cafe walking side by side, our hands close enough to feel each other's warmth, but not quite touching. The afternoon had that pale gold light early spring sometimes gives as an apology for winter. The river smelled faintly of damp wood. When we reached the middle of the pedestrian bridge, he stopped. "I've always liked this spot," he said. "People are moving somewhere on either side of you, but here you get a moment to be between. It's the only place in the city where I don't feel late for anything." I laughed softly. "Then let's not be late. Not to this, I mean. Let's not rush it into something before it knows what it is." "Agreed," he said, and the word felt like a small, shared promise. Over the next few weeks, we found a rhythm that didn't break anything else. We met for a quick lunch near my office. We walked through the Saturday farmers' market, weaving between stalls of peaches and sunflowers, the vendors pressing paper napkins into our hands along with samples of jam and cheese. He told me stories about growing up in a small town where everyone waved from their porches whether they knew you or not. I told him about the first apartment I rented after college, where the floor slanted just enough that a dropped pen would roll under the couch unless I caught it. We were trading small stones for a path that might one day have a shape. Clara found out, of course. She waited until we were washing dishes together after a Sunday potluck, and then said it in her no-nonsense voice. "I like him. I like you. I like you two together. I just need to know I won't wake up one morning and find out my boss broke my friend's heart." I rinsed a bowl and handed it to her. "I can't promise anyone won't get hurt," I said. "But I can promise we're both awake." She bumped my hip with hers and nodded. That's all I needed to hear. There was a day it rained from morning to night, the kind of spring rain that erases the horizon and folds the city into a small, wet origami. My umbrella turned inside out halfway across the street, and I arrived at the cafe looking like I'd gone for a swim. Walter stood when he saw me, his face tugged into a grin he was trying to straighten. He handed me a clean napkin, as if that could solve anything. We sat and watched the rain braid itself into silver strings. Without planning to, we found the kind of silence that doesn't feel like absence at all, but presence without effort. When the rain softened to a steady whisper, he asked if I had time to see something. We drove to an old neighborhood lined with maple trees. He pulled up in front of a narrow shop with a faded sign, "Horvath and Sons Watch Repair." Inside, the air smelled of oil and time. An elderly man with a magnifying lens peered up from his bench. Walter introduced me to Mr. Horvath as if he were a dignitary. Walter reached into his pocket and placed a small object on the counter. It was a watch, round-faced and modest, the kind that kept time without announcing itself. The crystal was cracked. The leather band was worn soft. "It belonged to my father," he said. "He wore it every day for as long as I can remember. It stopped 2 summers ago. I haven't been ready to fix it until now." The watchmaker lifted it gently and turned it over in his hands. He made small approving noises, the way old men do when a machine has done what it was meant to do for far longer than anyone expected. He said he could repair it. We left it there like you might leave a plant with a neighbor, hopeful it would be tended. Back in the car, I rested my hand on Walter's forearm. "Thank you for bringing me," I said. He shook his head. "Thank you for being the person I wanted to bring." That afternoon, in the quiet of my living room, I realized what was happening between us wasn't loud, and it wasn't spectacle. It was the slow accretion of small, careful moments, stacked like plates in a cabinet, ready when needed. He wasn't filling a lack in me, and I wasn't patching a hole in him. We were each whole already, but between us there was a space where something new was learning to stand. Of course, not everything was easy. Once, during a staff meeting, Clara mentioned Walter's name too casually and then flushed, and later she texted me that she felt awkward, as if she were balancing two fragile bowls at once. I told Walter, and he suggested we meet the next day to talk not about us, but about boundaries. We made a list on a napkin. Keep work separate. Keep Clara's comfort central. No office visits. No surprise appearances at team events. It felt almost unromantic, but I found myself breathing easier. There is a kind of love that thrives on spontaneity. Ours would be built on trust. There was a dry, bright Saturday when he came by to help me fix the wobble in my kitchen table. He arrived with a small toolbox that looked as if it had seen half a century of repairs, and whispered with a smile that it had belonged to his grandfather. We tipped the table on its side, and he showed me how to wedge a folded note card beneath one leg to find true level, then tightened the bolts in a slow cross pattern. When he finished, he pressed his palm to the tabletop and gave it the gentlest push. The table didn't shiver. "See?" he said. "Strength isn't always about adding more. Sometimes it's about tightening what's already there." We cooked afterward, moving around each other like we'd rehearsed it. He chopped onions with that neat, deliberate motion men of his generation learned from fixing things. I stirred the sauce and pretended not to notice when he wiped his hands on the towel and reached to tuck a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The skillet hissed. The radio chimed an old song I remembered from a road trip years ago, and we both recognized it in the same breath. "That's the one with the chorus you only think you know," I said. "You sing the first line wrong and then pretend you meant to." He laughed, a warm, rolling sound, and I felt it in my ribs. After dinner, we stood by the window with our mugs. The city was settling. A neighbor walked his dog, the leash a slack line between them. Somewhere, a television audience applauded. The air through the screen had that faint mineral smell of water on hot pavement. Walter set his mug down and turned toward me, his expression open, not searching for my answer, but waiting for it. I stepped closer, close enough to see the tired half-moons beneath his eyes, the silver at his temples that looked like dawn before sunrise. He lifted his hand and paused, a breath caught between us. "Is this all right?" he said. "Yes," I said, and I meant it the way a door means it when it swings on well-oiled hinges. He kissed me. Not the kind of kiss that tries to convince you of anything, but the kind that says, "I know where I end and you begin, and I am grateful for both." It was tender and unhurried, and when we parted we both had that look people wear when they've remembered a word that sat on the tip of the tongue all morning. We didn't rush past that moment. We didn't try to turn it into a new rule. We sat and talked instead, about the ways life surprises you when you've almost stopped expecting it to, about the odd generosity of time, about the rooms inside us we keep closed until the right company arrives. Before he left, he squeezed my hand once in the doorway, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. I watched him cross the hallway and go down the stairs. When the door below clicked shut, the apartment didn't feel empty. It felt like a page that had been turned and was ready for the next line. Days became weeks. The watch was repaired. Mr. Corvath called and said he'd replaced the crystal and coaxed the movement back to life, a phrase I loved more than I should have. We picked it up together. Walter fastened the band around his wrist and held it to his ear, that ancient gesture, and smiled. You would think listening to a watch is a young man's habit, he said. It isn't. It's a hope you never outgrow, that the world is still quietly ticking along. There was one more conversation we needed to have, the one neither of us could avoid. We sat in the park under a sycamore as the leaves trembled like small green coins. He told me, carefully, about the years after his marriage ended, about learning how to cook just enough for one and then relearning how to cook for two at Thanksgiving when his son visited. I told him about my own long season of competent loneliness, the calendar filled with things that made sense and none that surprised me. We agreed not to try to replace what had been lost. We would instead make something that stood on its own legs, like the table we'd leveled together. It could have been complicated. It could have turned into whispers or second-guessing or late-night speculation among people we didn't owe explanations to. But it didn't. Maybe because we were careful. Maybe because we were lucky. Maybe because we were old enough to know that the only way through is through with courtesy. One evening, as summer began to lean into the city with a warm hand, we returned to the pedestrian bridge. The river had the restless energy it gets when the days run long. We stood with our elbows on the railing. The light turned the water to a ribbon of brass. He looked at me as if about to say something difficult. Instead, he reached for my hand, and I gave it to him. We stood that way, two people in the middle of something that hadn't yet put a name to itself, and didn't need to. If you had asked me, months earlier, what I wanted, I would have said something practical. Stability, quiet, a good night's sleep. I didn't know how to ask for what I really wanted, which was this: a person who makes ordinary places feel newly lit. A person who doesn't rescue me, but reminds me I'm not alone in the work of being myself. A person who knows that respect is not a doorway into love. It is the floor you stand on while you build it. On our way back across the bridge, a group of teenagers ran past, their laughter scattering like marbles. We stepped aside, and Walter put a hand lightly at the small of my back, a gesture so instinctive and brief I might have missed it if I hadn't been paying attention. I was paying attention to everything now, the kindnesses, the pauses, the ways a day declares itself good without needing an announcement. Later that night, in the quiet of my apartment, I opened a blank page and wrote down what I knew: that the world I kept small on purpose had grown of its own accord, that I could hold care and caution in the same palm, that I could want more without spilling what I already had. I wrote his name, not because I needed to see it there, but because it felt honest. Then I closed the page, turned out the light, and lay down with a feeling I hadn't had in years, something between contentment and anticipation, a promise spiraling softly through the dark. The next morning, Clara sent a picture of a sunrise from her window, all peach and blue, and the thin, bright edge of the day. Underneath she typed, "New chapter." I looked at the photo for a long time. Then I wrote back, "Not new, just truer." When I stepped outside, the city was already awake. A bus wheezed to a stop. A man in a blue cap watered the petunias in the planter outside his shop. Somewhere, a kettle sang. I walked toward the cafe by the river, not hurried, not late for anything, ready to find Walter with that familiar look on his face that said we were exactly where we should be. Two people, careful and open, making something sturdy from attention and time. And if you're listening to this from some city far from mine, with your own river and your own bridge and your own uncertain morning, I hope this finds you the way it found me, not with fireworks, but with the quiet sound of a door unlocking from the inside.